Are you a businesswoman who is finding it challenging to get your ideas across and make a point? Welcome to Speakers Who Get Results with Elizabeth Bachman, a podcast dedicated to helping women get the visibility they want, whether making a speech or talking in a meeting. Every week, get valuable lessons from Elizabeth or learn from her roundtable conversations with experts and speakers on how to make a difference, not just a point. On to the show with your host, Elizabeth Bachman.
Hello and welcome to Speakers Who Get Results. I'm Elizabeth Bachman, your host, and this is the podcast where we interview experts from around the world about how do you use presentation skills to become visible and valued, and the many challenges that we need to overcome as a presenter, presentation skills, communication, and the strategy that belongs to that. I am also a former opera director, and this year, this particular episode is the end of my first year of Speakers Who Get Results. Over the course of the year, I've interviewed so many experts that about business, leadership, the various aspects of that. But I also did a special series called The Relationship Between Business and Art, where I interviewed opera singers, opera directors, conductors, and other people who are involved in the performing arts, talking about the business of it. Today, I'm very excited because I get to interview a wonderful friend whom I've known for many years, about how, from a composer's point of view, and about justice. Patrice Michaels is the daughter-in-law of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And no, that's not the beginning of her bio. She's actually a very accomplished performer and composer, who's well known for the beauty of her musical compositions, the beauty of her voice, and the various things that she's done. She combines these in a song cycle about the life of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She's done a couple of song cycles about the Notorious RBG. And for the international listeners who aren't familiar with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she was the late Supreme Court Justice who made such a difference in women's rights and arguing women's rights. I'm wearing pearls because pearls were one of her trademarks, so I'm wearing my pearl earrings for this. Patrice Michaels is the perfect person to interview for my end of the year, end of the season episode to talk about art, leadership, and our spiritual second guest, the Notorious RBG. Patrice Michaels, welcome to Speakers Who Get Results.
Thank you, Elizabeth Bachman.
I am just so happy to have you here. We've known each other for a very long time, so back and forth, and you were on my list to interview for next year's The Relationship Between Art and Business. And then something came up with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who has been a big part of your life and a big part of your composing life. And I just thought this would be a perfect summation for the end of the first year of Speakers Who Get Results, where we talk about business, we talk about art, and we talk about the art of presenting. So Patrice, you do all of that together, and I'm just so delighted to have you with us today.
Well, it's always a pleasure to talk about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, my mother-in-law.
Yeah.
Amazing person.
Well, and also to talk about you. So one of the things that I ask all my guests is who would be their dream interview? Although today is kind of like Madame Ginsburg, Justice Ginsburg is kind of a second guest on this podcast. So could you talk just a little bit about what it was like to interview her. And
Yeah.
you think of what she would say now. What would you?
Yeah,
Any
my
thoughts about that?
husband teases me because as it's turned out, due to my choice to write a song cycle about her, the work that I had to do interviewing her to really understand the family has led me down some really interesting rabbit holes in American history and in the family history and in my own relationship with feminism and public life.
Mhm.
So I know she would be a lot of people's dream interviewee. And I felt like I had a very lucky opportunity to be able to ask her things that, as a regular daughter in law, I might not have felt bold enough to do, honestly. And I guess this is a good time to do our first show and tell. The product of a lot of our time spent talking about her life and her ideas is this song cycle, 9 songs, of course. And of course, the title was so obvious to me because she always took the long view. She always strategized to imagine what the ultimate best good could be, winning the war, not the battles, but wanting to win the battles too.
Yeah.
So this artwork, by the way, is by the wonderful Constance P. Beatty, Kim Beatty, who is her official portrait artist. And this is one of the preliminary sketches that she allowed me to use for that. So thank you very much to Kim, who would also be a fabulous person to interview on this series.
Okay.
But I guess the place I'd like to start reflecting on what I was able to ask her has mostly to do with her mother. Her mother, she often would credit in public as being the most important influence on her, as being the most intelligent person that she had met in her life, and wishing so much that her mother would have been in circumstances that would have allowed her to achieve what she could have achieved. The little gold circlet that you often see in images of her, which is prominently displayed in the movie On the Basis of Sex, that is actually a replica that they made for the movie, which surprised me that they went to that level of detail, but it's fantastic. That was Celia's, her mother's, and one of the few things that RBG owned of her mother's. And there were no documents remaining, no letters, no family writings, through a series of unfortunate circumstances. I was fortunate to interview her biographers, Wendy Williams and Mary Hartnett, when I began the process of putting materials together, and learned a bit about Celia's background and began to understand a few things about her. The idea that she named Ruth Joan, and the older daughter, who passed away very sadly of meningitis, Marilyn, those were surprising names to me. Joan and Marilyn sound very glamorous names to me from, that period in the late 20s, early 30s. And of course, Ruth was then renamed by her big sister Marilyn Kiki, because she kicked as a baby. She was constantly in motion. Mm-hmm. So there are very close people to this day that will refer to RBG as Kiki. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, Ruth stuck, and she preferred Ruth, which, of course, you can't spell truth without Ruth. So there's just so many lovely, lovely echoes of Celia. in all of this. And I wanted to try to understand who RBG saw when she saw her mother. And having to learn about the passing of Marilyn from, an ear infection that got out of control. And in those days, and of all the things I believe I have appreciated about my mother-in-law, I think that is the number one thing I appreciate about her. Her desire to work on behalf of something worth working for. That's noble, truly noble. And I think that's maybe the reason why the public outpouring of love for her, this tiny little bubby packaged up in this surprising little package, but full of nobility. I think that's why people respond to her so much, because that is her fundamental value.
Well, let's talk a little bit about you, because that's one of the things that I'm interested about in you, and how you and one of the things I know that you shared with RBG is your commitment to social justice. As a composer, as an artist, one of the reasons I wanted to interview you, you've been on my want list, my wish list, is because of a composer. And we haven't had somebody who creates and the sort of the creative spirit. And you mentioned once something about going from various different worlds and feeling like an outsider. I think a lot of people do feel like outsiders.
I love
expand
that.
on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's been a great advantage for me as a creator or as a performer to have to struggle with my identity constantly. And I'm sure it goes all the way back to my own family upbringing, because I frankly grew up in an Orange County, California style Republican household. And although I wasn't quite old enough to participate in the activities of the 60s, I was somewhat aware of what was going on. And I love that my family instilled in me also a sense that you should strive for justice. We just ended up believing in different ideas of what is just, I think.
Different definitions of the
Different
word.
definitions.
Yes.
So I was very fortunate also to be the first in my family to graduate from college, although my brother did eventually get an undergrad degree. I'm the one who stayed in academia, and I'm the one who, is able to pull together my work life with my social vision. And I feel very fortunate in that I can write about and sing about things that I think are meaningful. And of course, you can do that by singing about flowers, because flowers are absolutely meaningful. And I love those times that I've been able to do that. But as a composer, of course, having the influence of RBG and the opportunity to discuss American history with her will inform the rest of my writing life. No question about it. The next thing I have to show you is my most recently published work.
I was just going to mention this. Yes.
Yes, as we know, we had a big anniversary that was somewhat eclipsed by unfortunate events in our country, but the 19th Amendment ratification did not go unappreciated by a lot of people. And there's a beautiful exhibit, which I believe will be permanent, at the National Constitution Center.
And for our international listeners, the 19th Amendment was the amendment that allowed women the vote. And 2020 was the 100th anniversary of this.
Thank you. Yes.
So Resolved is a song cycle.
It's a
for those who are just listening. Yes, you can't see us.
Yes, and I wish you could see the image of Trixie Fraganza, who is resplendent in her giant hat her very big hair, her beautiful stole draped across her shoulders, and a banner that says woman suffrage, because at the time it was woman suffrage. And she is dressed in her coat, standing on the stairs, ready to go out and march. And because I have fortunately been asked to write about this, and this material was presented at the National Constitution Center and filmed with Janae Bridges singing the wonderful mezzo.
Well, and Janae Bridges was the first interview in my the relationship between business and art series. So she was
fabulous.
So she is the lead-off interview in that series that premiered earlier this year.
Well, she is a wonderful person, a fabulous singer, and we were very fortunate to have NBC donate its considerable resources to videoing the cycle, so you can see it online.
We will absolutely post the links in the show notes for this.
But learning about RBG's relationship, thinking about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who are usually the first two names that come to mind with the 19th Amendment, that's a nice jumping off point. But as I've done my own research and created the narrative that I look for in this cycle, I find that a good example of maybe the second thing that I would say that I most appreciate having learned from RBG. And that is that with each age or era comes certain opportunities and privileges that the previous generation may not have. Mm-hmm. Famously and regularly, we hear the quote of RBG that one should lead in such a manner that encourages others to follow.
That is actually one of the quotes that I use all the time, because so much of my work is about helping women who have a seat at the table and still aren't being listened to. Mm-hmm. So it's and if you stand up and shout and say, "God damn it, listen to me, I have something to say," people reject it. People will back off. So I use that quote all the time, is, fight for what you care about. Don't just sit back and take it. Do fight for what you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you. Mm-hmm. And that is really one of the themes that I come back to over and over again, how you walk that tightrope.
Yes, what exactly is the right way to do that? And another famous thing that you will often hear her say in interviews is an example of that, of a strategy for achieving that goal. And she adored her mother-in-law, whom I never met. Nana in the family has a lot of lore, so I regret that I never met her. But on the wedding day of Ruth and Marty Ginsburg, Marty's mother came to Ruth and said, "My dear, this is what I want you to have. This is a present for you. I want you to know that in a good marriage, it helps sometimes to be a little bit deaf." And she handed her mother, her daughter-in-law to be, a pair of earplugs.
I love it. Yeah.
Well, yes, I must say, I have struggled mightily with this model that has been presented by my mother-in-law all these years. It is absolutely essential that she was a little bit deaf to many of the slings and arrows that she has received. Mm-hmm. And by being able to let them bounce off of her, she was able to secure her spot amongst people who didn't want her there. And I fully appreciate her for that. And I understand that that was a strategy that worked for her. But
it is, yes, strategy is really the key. So, yeah.
So my question is, as the next generation down, do I still have to use that strategy? And in this song cycle, I decided that I was going to push that envelope a little bit, because as I was reading about the history of the 19th Amendment and the way it came about, it's always, it's a dirty mess of sausage making, getting anything like this done.
It took decades too.
It took 80 years, 80 years to get this done. And so interesting that many states had already, allowed women to vote as a means of getting women to come to their states. Mm-hmm. Wyoming, for instance. And the role that Black women played in making this happen has been grossly underrepresented in typical history narrative. So I made sure that the center of this cycle revolves around 3 suffragists. Sojourner Truth, who would be the only name that most people would know, mm-hmm. although she's not always associated with suffragism. Mary Church Terrell, who was just inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame just a few months ago. And Ida B. Wells, of course, a great hero for those of us who live in Chicago, and just a brilliant strategist. And maybe not as deaf, even in her generation, as RBG sometimes would choose to be, to strategize. Maybe a little more edgy.
So let me ask you, Madam Composer,
yes.
A little bit about the arc of a story and the arc of a song, how you get from beginning to end. Now, those of us who work in opera, we think about this all the time, mm-hmm. but really the composers had to figure that out. It certainly is something that happens when you're doing a presentation. You have to think about the arc of the presentation and, where do you want to get to?
Yeah.
As a composer, how do you think about shaping the arc of a song? Because it is a presentation just as much as a keynote speech is.
Of course. It depends so much on what the song is. In the case of Celia, the song about RBG's mother, there were no documents available. There was only lore. So I had to figure out some way to tell her story and make sure that she occupied a place in the song cycle that was substantive, mm-hmm. and grounding. So I thought, well, I could get a lot of information in if I made Celia write a letter to Kiki, because Kiki went off to summer camp every summer. And the year that Celia was dying of uterine cancer, she would have known that she was dying while Kiki was away at camp. So that's a structure that allows me to both have Celia talk directly to Kiki and pull out and reflect herself in her mind on what she's thinking and feeling. So just creating a structure was really fun and challenging, and maybe the scariest thing I ever did with my mother-in-law. Because what kind of nerve is that for anyone to come along and think they can write a letter that sounds like her mother, So I was anxious about it. And I was very fortunate also to have the support of Daniel Stiepelman, who was the screenwriter for On the Basis of Sex. Mm-hmm. Daniel is RBG's nephew. So he's a sort of in-law thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, hey, Daniel, will you please take a look at this and see, before I share it with her, tell me what you think. And that was extremely helpful. It gave me a little more courage. And she had very little, by the time she saw it, she had very little to tweak. In fact, this is hilarious. One of the few things she said was, Celia, her mother, had marched in the New York marches for women's suffrage.
Mm-hmm.
And in the end of the letter, I have her reflecting, where is my strength? Why do I feel so weak now? When I marched as a suffragette, I felt so strong. And when RBG read that, she said, it's not suffragette, it's suffragist.
Yes.
So that was just lovely. Lovely, lovely.
Another thing I want to ask you about, again, leadership, which has been a theme through all these interviews that I've been having. And the leadership of putting yourself out there and saying, and standing up and saying, I have something to say. Now, clearly, there's all sorts of documentation about RBG and what she did, but also for you to stand up, standing out as a performer is one thing, standing out as a composer is another. Where does that connect to assuming the leadership and saying, I have a right to be heard?
Well, I think that this is a very good time to be talking about that really directly, especially for Americans in regard to the Black Lives Matter movement. Janae and I have had many really substantive conversations.
Janae Bridges was the mezzo-soprano.
Yes. Janae is Black, and I wrote this 19th Amendment cycle specifically for her voice. And I loved that I was able to make the focal point of the narrative 3 Black women. The next person who has sung this is a young mezzo of Lebanese American heritage at Boston University in their Young Artist program. And immediately the production team was very concerned about whether a non-Black woman had a right to sing the words of Black women. And this has been a really shocking development for me as a 64-year-old to see that my students at Northwestern, who are in their early 20s, are anxious and concerned about whether they have a right to express about things that are not from their own ethnicity and social understanding. I'm coming to peace with it, but I am very much of the opinion that we should all be trying to understand each other's truths and standing up for each other's truths. And I want to be able to speak the words of Mohandas Gandhi. I want to be able to speak the words of Biko, wherever in the world, and whoever it is. If it's a value that I have, I'm genuinely expressing, their words and my beliefs. So that is a concern for the younger people, that they would be co-opting or appropriating material if they're of the white majority right now. So these people at Boston solved this by sort of reworking my piece, and I haven't seen their final project yet. I can't wait. They had one Black woman in their program who spoke some of the text and sang some of the text of the Black suffragists. And everyone on their team is very comfortable with how they worked it out, and I can't wait to see what they did. But when they were struggling with it, they called me and I had to say, look, as soon as a piece leaves my pen or, is published, it's out of my control, and I understand that. It's going to be changing, morphing. People are going to have their own perspectives on it, and I might like it and I might not, but I don't have any control over it. So that's an interesting position to be in.
And that really makes you think about adding your interpretation to someone else's words and having your words quoted and interpreted by other people is an interesting, what's in the public domain and what isn't.
Right.
And
right.
things like that.
And, our perspective changes so much. Of course, RBG was dealing with this every time she had a case to look at that had to do with the actual Constitution and the actual authors of the Constitution. Those who are so-called originalists are always looking for what the founding fathers actually meant. And if we lived in a world where that was possible to achieve, I would not like that world at all. I would not have a vote.
Yes,
I would
exactly
be surrounded by enslaved people, So we all build on each other's meaning, whether we want to or not.
Patrice Michaels, that is a wonderful phrase to end on. Thank you so much for having been a guest on Speakers Who Get Results. I'm honored to have wrapped up this first year with you as my special celebrity guest.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. It's been a great pleasure to be with you, to try to answer your questions, think about these things that I love to think about. And I wish you and all of your listeners and watchers that all of your best and finest ideas come to fruition in 2021 and beyond.
Thank you, everybody. This has been Speakers Who Get Results. And if you're interested in learning more, you can find us on YouTube. You can find us on any of your podcast episodes. And remember, if you're curious about how your presentation skills stack up, go to our free assessment at speakforresultsquiz.com. It only takes 4 minutes, and then you can see where your presentation skills are strong and are getting you what you need, and where you might need a little bit of support. This has been Elizabeth Bachman, and I'll see you on the next one.
We have just concluded another great episode of Speakers Who Get Results with your host, Elizabeth Bachman. If you got value from today's episode, please feel free to share us with your friends and colleagues. You may also visit elizabethbachman.com for additional resources. Be sure to tune in every week for new episodes, and thanks for tuning in.